I'm joined once again by my colleague, Sydney Bridger, to recap everything that's been going on with WR and benchmarking. So, Sydney, can you tell us what you've been cooking up with the Immigration Benchmarking Collective?
Definitely. We've been cooking up a lot of things. The first thing, though, I want to highlight and what we can talk about today is our tech roundtable discussion that we hosted virtually last week. The subject was on green card sponsorship policies. Our green card sponsorship benchmarking survey was fielded from May 21st to June 26th, and we had 64 respondents with an average of folks with 12 years of experience in the HR, immigration, and our global mobility industry. And then the average program size was 263. So we were super excited to see this big number. But for the roundtable discussion, we broke that down even further. So we invited medium to large size programs in the tech sector. Each person received a special report with segmented benchmarking data. For the specialized report, there were 12 companies with an average of 13 years of experience in the industry. And the average program size was 500 US foreign nationals. Our aim for the roundtable discussion was to spur a discussion where participants can really dive deeper into these policies and strategies that they've implemented or are considering for their programs. And I must say, it was a real success, and I'm pumped to do future roundtables in the future. From the discussion, we realized that the top three pain points from the survey were perm processing time, the impact of layoffs, and cost containment. The discussion was truly eye-opening, and being able to learn from other global mobility professionals was something I never really had the opportunity to do. I felt that my perspective was very much linear. I knew my program, I knew my resources, I knew the vendors we used, but being able to hear from other professionals in the industries really did open up my mind to say, oh, this is great. Like maybe we could have done this for my program. Maybe we could have thought about this. So I do really wish I could have participated in something like this when I was working in-house. But yeah, would love to pass it over to you, Laura. What were your biggest takeaways from the roundtable discussion?
Well, first, thanks for facilitating this. I've participated or hosted my own roundtables, and even the in-person ones I've led previously were not as engaged as this last week's tech roundtable was. Folks are really engaged to learn from each other and understand how their programs are solving ultimately the same challenges. So it was cool to see the creative approaches different program leaders were taking. So again, I learned a lot. My biggest takeaways from the tech roundtable last week were tenure requirements. Across the board, tech companies are just more aggressive with their immediate green card sponsorship. So that was interesting to hear and consistent among the tech global mobility leaders, as well as an increased pressure to consider green card sponsorship for F1 employees. So we heard a little bit about that, as well as a spectrum of F1 employee support, whether companies were involved and proactive in F1 CPT
Mm-hmm.
or if programs were very hands-off. So we'll dive a little bit deeper into what that discussion was. And then finally, the third takeaway was how programs are increasingly engaging in national interest waiver. Programs are calling it piloting the NIW because of the upcoming election. So
Right.
kind of digging deeper on the tenure requirements. Like I said, almost all the tech companies at our roundtable support day one green card sponsorship. That's contrasted to other industries which have, often a 6-month or 12-month tenure requirement. There was maybe one or two tech companies that had some tenure requirement, but the overwhelming majority were offering it on day one.
I found that super interesting because I feel like that varies across industries within the tech industry, whether that's consulting. We do see a lot of day one sponsorship in the tech field. So I really appreciate that. Like their employers are thinking, okay, this is how we sponsor someone from the date they first start at the firm versus 12 months in. It kind of creates confusion with teams. The cost, what does this mean? I've never heard of a green card process, especially if they're not familiar with it. So yeah, that was super eye-opening to me as well.
Yeah, I thought there was some really thoughtful framing about the immediate initiation of green card sponsorship. There were a couple of programs that considered it as just part of the onboarding process or the onboarding costs, rather, that it was all just baked in. And so I thought that was really thoughtful in the way they were budgeting for these foreign national employees that, again, baked into their onboard. Here's what an H-1B transfer costs. Here's how many H-1B extensions we expect in their company life cycle, as well as their green card sponsorship, whatever pathway they had been screened for, and that they were working closely with counsel to screen for all of these like life cycle processes and budgeting for fees. So that's all just approved with the approval of the onboarding or the hire or the offer, right? And so I think
Right.
that takes away some of the discretion or confusion from the manager, like you're saying, that a lot of other programs will have a tenure requirement that may have some sort of performance approval baked in that the manager then approves. And I will tell you that a lot of the managers that have to approve the green card initiation process, aren't experts in immigration. So are really confused about like, when does the fees hit? Or is there any guarantee for this employee that it just becomes just way too much for the manager to manage, where when it's baked into the onboarding process, it's the HR global mobility professional that is assessing this in the package. And so I thought that made a ton of sense.
Right.
I thought that was a really cool way the companies were thinking about it, framing it, budgeting for it.
Yeah. And it really takes away from, the time an HR professional has, right, during the day to day.
Right.
Because if you're dealing with a bunch of different functions, a bunch of different managers, I remember day to day when I was working in house, I pretty much had like an FAQ list. Okay, here's how much the green card program costs. Perm is this much, I-140, I-485 is this. So yeah, it really does take away from the day to day too, I think.
Yeah. And the other thing that came up as part of the discussion is some of these companies have moved away from performance scales, which is definitely something I've heard in the tech sector from an HR trend, that instead of giving these like 1 through 5 ratings, companies are moving away from that. So when I talk about other industries having tenure requirements with performance baked in, well, if your company doesn't even have a performance scale anymore because the HR system or HR structure has moved away from the performance scale, well, you're not going to consider that as part of any kind of benefit granting, including immigration benefits. So why not just initiate immediately, because there's not that hurdle anymore. And again, it takes away the discretion from the manager who, may have some challenges with an employee, but otherwise the performance is okay. So I think it was just sort of an interesting perspective from companies that are doing HR structuring a little bit differently, moving away from the traditional. It was really insightful to hear the stories behind and the context behind initiating green cards immediately.
Most definitely. And it's really important for some companies to consider performance. But like you said, some companies just don't have that metric within their function. So learning how the tech companies themselves kind of structure their policies, I think that was a main topic of discussion with a lot of back and forth. Like, oh, this is how you do it. But, we don't even have a performance scale. So, just gathering ideas from the roundtable, I thought was really helpful for folks.
Yeah, and that just brought to mind another point in the discussion that was really interesting that I hadn't heard previously was, the average tenure for a tech worker was like 2.5 years. So if these tech companies waited a year before initiating the green card, the opinion was they would not complete the green card sponsorship cycle for that employee and really put that employee in a real tough position to maintain work authorization. Now, I know these tech companies aren't considering when the tech worker moves to another company. That's surely not why they're creating policies. But the reality is that was, the average tenure of their employees. So they didn't want to pretend like that didn't exist. And so I thought they were meeting some of these tough employee challenges with a realistic and practical solution.
Definitely.
The next thing I want to dig into is F1 employee support. So while we were just talking about how almost unanimously companies in the tech sector are initiating green card sponsorships immediately, there's a set aside for F1 employees. So almost unanimously, with an immediate green card sponsorship, companies are not moving forward if that employee is in F1 status. And we didn't really get into the pro con, but Sid, will you entertain me and we can kind of go through why would a company want to sponsor F1s immediately and why wouldn't they?
Yeah, I I think there's multiple reasons, right? So it does depend on the program as to what you want to entertain in terms of your policy. But I do understand the hesitancy of that, especially in the tech industry, because, like you said, the average retention of an employee is 2 years or so. What does that mean? Like, do we spend all of this money now to, further support our employee? But with the day one sponsorship, it does make sense to get it started for folks not on F1 status. So there's a whole bunch of different ways you can look at this. And I just found that really intriguing to kind of learn from other people to kind of see what was out there.
Yeah, I think, the hesitancy to sponsor F1 employees for immediate green card is the risk of eliminating any international travel for that F1 employee. And one thing I've learned in my practice is often these new grads, which is what an F1 employee is, are given that postgraduate OPT. So they just graduated, they get 1 year work authorization. If STEM, they are given another 2. Some of these employees really need to be led. And so by sponsoring an F1 employee immediately for a green card, you're shutting down their ability to internationally travel. And someone may say, yep, I really want the green card, proceed. But they don't necessarily understand the implications of, well, when your brother or your sister gets married, your mom's sick, like you have very limited options to travel. And so I think companies are really hesitant to sign up their employees for that kind of liability. The one company that was in this benchmarking roundtable that did sponsor F1s for green card day one, they had a real proactive conversation with that F1 employee, had them, agree, confirm in a written authorization of the risks they were assuming. And so they felt comfortable then moving forward because, yeah, they are adults. They can agree to risks. I think there's just some hesitancy on companies that they're like, we don't want to be involved with putting this big restriction on these employees,
Right.
especially given, I think, decreased H-1B selection rates. They just feel like the risk might be too high. That's the sense I get. Again, we didn't dive too deep into that conversation. What was really interesting, again, was how unanimously these programs were not supporting F1s for immediate green card sponsorship. There was one outlier. Also, there was this huge spectrum of F1 support, specifically when the F1's maxing out of their OPT STEM work authorization cycle. Some programs were really proactive with talking with these F1 last chancers. So if they were elected in the H&B after their last chance, and proposing CPT, creating forums for employees who may want to engage in CPT. Now, the company wasn't promoting or selecting CPT programs, but rather creating a conversation for those types of employees to
Mhm.
discuss that amongst themselves. And then again, flagging to their employees that may want to take CPT what that process would look like. Other programs were completely hands off. They don't track it. It's a much more choose your own adventure for those folks. And they take the perspective that because the employer is not involved in the CPT sponsorship, it's not employer driven, that the employee needs to go out and figure that out on their own and then present the work authorized document to maintain their work authorization with the employer. I don't know. Any thoughts, Sid, about we heard it all?
We heard it all. That's completely true. I feel like it was either hit or miss for CPT, right?
Yeah.
So companies either feel comfortable with it or they don't. But I think a lot of the times, the CPT, you don't really have, or the business, I should say, doesn't really have reason to push back, right? Because, okay, you do have work authorization, but okay, here's all the reasons maybe we don't want you to work via CPT. But, businesses are kind of, their hands are tied at that point. Another interesting point that just came to my mind as well as you were talking, Laura, is companies will transfer folks abroad for, 12, 13 months and then return them on that L intercompany visa. We did hear that that's an option too, that folks were laying out, HR professionals, like, hey, your STEM is expiring this date. You weren't selected in the H-1B lottery. Here are your options. But if you don't select these options, as in transferring abroad or, F1 CPT or whatever that may look like, they agreed to mutually depart ways, which, I found that interesting and really insightful too, just to make sure that employees know all of their options up front. but it's one of the most stressful times in their lives, right? So being able to provide empathy in that situation. So tech companies across the board are also trying to manage that employee communication.
Yeah, definitely. I think, where we heard a spectrum of what companies are willing to do for CPT support, we did hear a majority of companies look to transfer F1 max outs outside the US. And we heard many of them have affiliates. Often it's a Canadian option. We heard that, when there is that transfer abroad, the majority, like 90% of those cases are coming back to the US, again, driven by business need, whether they can accommodate that transfer, but it's happening overwhelmingly. And that the majority of those foreign nationals transferred outside the US do come back. And that we heard a really high level of appreciation from managers when those foreign national employees come back, whether that's under a, transferee visa or whatever, they come back to the US and they're bringing new skills, new insights into the company to the US team. And so one tech company said the manager who was benefiting from these, like, returning foreign nationals were saying, can we send more people? Like, this is really benefiting our group. We're learning so much from this, like, cross-pollination, which was really cool,
Yeah.
and love to hear it. The other sort of point on this that I'll just sort of spend just 2 seconds on is that we were hearing when global mobility leaders were managing F1, CPT, or having these proactive conversations, or even leading the sort of transfer process to affiliates abroad. They were doing that all through their HRIS management system. So there was a really robust conversation among the leaders about, what's HRIS system are you using? So that to me just really signals that, despite the vendor platforms that, I know we are in every day, that global mobility leaders are really leveraging their HRIS systems internally.
Yeah, no, that was a huge topic, HRIS systems and how many or not even HRIS systems, but just systems in general that people are using. And, I think that depends on a variety of facts. If you use like external vendors, contractors, et cetera. And if you have a more complicated kind of system of what you use in terms of your technology, how do you make that work too?
Okay, to wrap up, the third big takeaway was how programs are excited and leveraging national interest waivers. So this, again, we've talked about it on our podcast here before, and there's a lot of conversation out there in the U.S. immigration space that, national interest waiver is the antidote to lengthy perm processing. And so these tech program leads are really piloting national interest waiver. They're sort of setting up what is their company's like risk portfolio, like within moving forward with a viable case, like what kind of risk viability or case viability rather they are interested in submitting when they're assessing that with their immigration counsel. So it was really cool to hear that most of the programs are leveraging and filing national interest waivers, some more aggressively than others. And that we learned that, there are the programs that were not yet filing, were aware of it, interested. And I think after our conversation, Sid, are certainly going to be exploring it further with some piloting filings.
I agree. There is so much excitement for the NIW aspect. For the programs that weren't, pursuing the NIW, there were a lot of fruitful questions to kind of understand the risk involved too, because perm processing times are just so long. And I think everyone is just tired of it, right? So if you can provide a use case, like, okay, we had these 5 cases, the NIW, we avoided the perm, you can bring that to your leadership. Of course, they would be involved in that conversation from the get go, but it's really encouraging HR professionals to really strategically think ahead, which is awesome. And I love to see it.
Yeah, we had some of those leaders share their success stories with, like Sid said, leading those conversations of, hey, we tried these 5 cases. Here were the outcome, and we'd like to roll this out to the sort of larger program and sponsorship generally. We're calling it piloting because most of the leaders on the call also understood that this could change with the change of administration. So
Right.
realistically, the positivity in the national interest waiver is based on, administration policies, how currently the Biden administration is prioritizing industry and STEM professionals. And with a change in administration, could change these policies and very likely would change the outcomes of filing national interest waivers.
Yeah, it's something to keep a close eye on as well as we go through the next few months. And from an in-house perspective, this really did open my mind in terms of, the multiple pathways to green card sponsorship. There's other ways to kind of go about it, depending on the level of risk you want to take and the outcomes you've received. So, yeah, Laura, I would love to talk to you about our August benchmarking survey on immigration program management as well. We just kicked this off last week, and the survey will remain open until August 30th. You can find the survey link on our Immigration Benchmarking Collective group on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to send it to you via DM, or whoever wants to reach out, feel free to reach out to me. That survey really dives into staffing, resources, and vendors. We picked the subject of immigration program management because from my conversation with global mobility professionals across the industry, this really was top of mind, especially for 2025 planning. Are teams staffed efficiently, or what resources are other teams using? Is it beneficial to use multiple vendors? Our survey will capture these valuable insights for you to share with your team as a global mobility professional. So I'm really excited for this. And I think from our roundtable discussion last week, it kind of encouraged me to really think that this is top of mind for folks, and just seeing what else is out there for other teams could really benefit your program overall.
Yeah, I know global mobility leaders are always curious about checking under the hood for other programs. And the question I get is, are we staffed appropriately? Like, what do you see on your other clients, the ratio of foreign nationals to immigration specialists in-house? So I think that will be a really interesting insight, sort of the immediate headline of what and how our program's staffed, to understand whether our company contacts these global mobility leaders, are their case levels too high? How efficient are their programs running? Those types of quantifiable metrics. The other thing I'm really interested to understand is, the staff structure of the global mobility and immigration team. So working with different size of programs and within different industries, sometimes we see global mobility sit within legal. Sometimes we see it sit within HR. Sometimes we see it sit within talent acquisition. And my guess is where it sits depends on company size. Because some of the startup companies that I'm working with as they grow, you've got, an HR leader who wears multiple hats, or even a legal leader who wears multiple hats. One company, they have their global mobility person double as like their finance person.
Oh,
So I think
wow.
then as they get bigger, it becomes, a more sophisticated corporate structure. And I'd love to see some patterns there, because it'd just be interesting and curious. I'm curious about that. And then the other piece I'm really interested that this survey will dive deeper into is, how many HRIS systems or case management platforms does the global mobility team currently use? And I am very curious about this, because my suspicion is that folks may use multiple case platform systems, like with their internal HRIS, their immigration vendor, their tax vendor, their mobility vendor. I think we might get, an average of 3 systems someone might be using. And then in the roundtable, what I'd love to dig in deeper is, okay, but how much are you using those platforms?
Right.
And, the context we'll gain will be in those conversations, because my, again, suspicion is, and you're we're an in-house professional, so you'll have to speak to this too. I think folks just want to use one system, and they want to use their internal system, and they want that to have all the info. And it doesn't matter how many bells and whistles these vendor
Nope.
programs have. It's sort of like, what, I just have one system and I want it to be in the one that I log in every day.
I completely agree. Having one system, I think as an in-house immigration professional, just having correct, consistent data and having one HRIS system feed into any sort of case management system that your law firm uses is huge. But I also understand that, I've talked to multiple companies that, they use different vendors. And so they have different case management systems with those vendors, which works well for them too. So Laura, I'm so interested to kind of see the results of, what does this look like for programs? Because if you have an HRI system that fits into your case management system for your law firm, it's life changing. It would save on reporting, the amount of time day to day. It's just how to see how different teams use it. I'm super excited about that.
Yeah, I think we'll read out those results once we get the benchmarking back, but really dig in on those benchmarking roundtables. What other insights are you hoping to gain from the August benchmarking survey, Sid?
That's a great question, Laura. The two main questions that are really top of mind for me are if global mobility folks seem to have a clear career progression, because a lot of the times you feel kind of stuck in your one place unless someone leaves your team or, there's a restructuring of departments. So I am curious about that. And Laura, I'm curious if you've seen that with the companies you've worked with, if there seems to be any sort of anxiety in terms of that.
Yeah, I think it depends on, the career progression depends on two things, whether the company is growing and the company size to begin with. So if it is a large program with a developed and highly structured HR, global mobility department, I think there is. I think there's career progression and new projects going on, new initiatives to be involved in. I think some of the companies that stay mid-size that they, have been established and this is the size and they have two, global mobility positions because that's what it takes to support their program. Those ones have limited career progression within the global mobility. So I think those positions higher turnover. So just sort of observationally, but yeah, I think the survey will offer more data behind my, anecdotes there.
I completely agree. And if your team is growing, this benchmarking survey data could really be something you could use as leverage. Be, okay, this is the size of my team. We're growing by this amount. I'm one person. I need more help. So, really hoping that this August benchmarking survey will help folks overall.
Yeah, totally. I have so many clients that are in that position, so I'm so excited for the data to
Yeah.
help them justify the resources that they need so that they can take weekends off.
Yeah, that would be so nice. I completely agree, which leads me to my second main point that I do want people to see from our August survey is, what are the main priorities of your program? What does that look like? And I think a lot of the survey questions will kind of capture this data as well for folks, but curious to see, in regards to 2025 planning or, are you looking at other vendors? Are you looking to maybe use different resources? What does that look like for you? Or is it cost containment still? Staffing. So I think the survey will provide kind of an overall arching theme for individuals in the industry.
Yeah, and it sounded like, we received some initial results and the priorities are all over the map where
Right.
we heard the pain points are pretty consistent. Perm processing, cost containment are pain points. But what we're getting our initial read in, the priorities are all over the map, like compliance, developing policies, changing policies. So we don't see a pattern yet, but TBD on that. To wrap up, Sid, we got us all really excited about the August benchmarking survey. So, for listeners, if you haven't already, reach out to Sid to find out where to get involved in the Immigration Benchmarking Collective to participate in the August benchmarking survey and influence future surveys. So, if there's other things you're interested in understanding how other programs work or what's going on across your industry, Sydney is the one setting all that up, asking all the tough questions and putting out there some really great information. Any final thoughts, Sid?
Thank you for having me, Laura. I'm looking forward to our August benchmarking survey results. And just as a quick heads up, too, you'll receive a personalized report once you complete the survey as well, specialized to you and your company. So, looking forward to hearing from you. And like Laura said, please reach out to me with any questions. You can DM me on LinkedIn, send me an email. I'm super available. So,
Thanks for your insights and expertise.